I made this couture-inspired jacket in under 24 hours to wear to go see the Barbie movie. Here's some evidence. This photo was taken on Friday night at 5:41 p.m. You can see I'm just beginning to cut out fabric for the jacket. And then these photos, which are taken on a mannequin, are of the finished product the next day with buttonholes and buttons finished at 3:18 p.m. There was a deadline because I was actually going to see the movie, which started at 5:45 and had to take the train, but I got it done. And in this video, I'm going to tell you all about how I did it. And spoiler, I got a full night's sleep on Friday night. My name is Rebecca. I design, I sew, I crochet, and I enjoy sharing all of that with you on the internet, where you can find me on all social handles at Rebecca in Europe, and of course on the podcast that I co-host, Threaded Together. In this video, I'm going to be sharing the inspiration for the jacket, how I came up with the idea, the pattern, and the things that I did prior to Friday evening that helped me to be able to turn around the construction of this jacket so very quickly. Let's get into this story. I am toying with, I mean, we'll see. It's Tuesday when we're recording this. I'm seeing this on Saturday. But I have this, like a rainbow check terry toweling. I was like, that would make the cutest little jacket and skirt, very kind of Chanel inspired. But again, probably will not happen. The week before the Barbie movie came out, I was recording an episode of the podcast and we were talking about couture jacket making. During the recording, I realized I really like the idea of making my own outfit inspired by the Barbie movie. So I did. I made a jacket. So the first step, of course, is inspiration. The outfit I decided to make for myself for the Barbie movie is a take on the Vivienne Westwood adorable little jacket and skirt that Margot wore in London, I believe. This look, it felt like a reinterpretation of some of her ever so famous 1990s collections. Of course, the hallmarks, which I just couldn't get enough of, the sleeves and the neckline. And so I knew I wanted to incorporate those in the jacket that I was making. And I didn't want it to be all pink because I'm not really a super pink person, but I have this about 1.5 meters of this kind of 80s colorful check that I think is super cute. That felt very late 80s, had a ton of bright colors, including pink, but that's not very much fabric. So I also have, this is kind of like a checked canvas to play around with as well, potentially for trimming. And to me, it felt very Barbie. So that's where I started. Once I saw that Vivienne Westwood shape, I was reminded of a pattern that was in this fabulous couture, haute couture pattern making book. I drafted an updated bodice block. For those who don't know, it's basically just your measurements on a piece of paper, and it would just form like a very fitted kind of like tank top. For example, here's the back of it. And then from that block, I drafted this couture inspired shape, and I slightly changed the neckline, the collar, the front, and the sleeve shape to reflect the design that I was trying to achieve. So here is the front. It's gonna be really cool. And then I have the back drafted as well. And then today I need to toile because I want to make sure this fits me. I drafted the pattern on Wednesday, and while the jacket itself did take me a very short time to make, there was some supplemental work ahead of time, but technically if I had just had a pattern ready to go, I wouldn't have had to do that. So to give you a little timeline of all of the work that I did, on Wednesday I drafted a new bodice block and drafted the jacket pattern. On Thursday I drafted the skirt pattern that became a disaster. I toiled the skirt, and also on Thursday I started a toile of the jacket, which if you don't know what that means, I just made a prototype, which meant I tested out the pattern. So let's spend a moment on this toiling bit. With jacket making, and honestly I think with most complicated sewing, the ratio of prep ironing to actually like sitting in front of your machine stitching is probably about 90% all of the other stuff. Prep, pinning, ironing, and about 10% actually stitching. Toiling allows you to test that 90% and make sure that you're doing it properly. It allows you to also test the fit of your pattern. So in this case, my toile really helped prepare for the final garment. All of the techniques I used for notching and kind of flattening those curves and all of that good stuff are directly out of Claire Schaefer's book, Couture Tailoring, a Construction Guide for Women's Jackets. And this was something that I picked up at the recommendation of my friends after taking that couture jacket making course last summer. And it has most of the things that we learned in that class, but it's a really handy dandy guide. When I'm saying that this was a couture-inspired jacket, part of it is because it was a haute couture pattern, but the other part of it is a lot of the techniques that were used are straight out of kind of what you do in a couture jacket. However, it is not 60% hand finished, so it does not count as couture. So we'll say couture inspired in this case. A toile is usually done in like a canvas or some sort of throwaway fabric, or something that honestly is a little bit easier to work with than your actual final garment, so that you maybe can get a little bit of practice on getting something the way you want it to look. I just use this vintage IKEA fabric that feels very much like a canvas, and is also really easy to take apart. Once you sew something, you can just kind of like pull it apart and it doesn't get damaged at all. Unlike this fabric, which has quite a decent pile to it. And that element of the fabric gives it its character and texture, but at the same time, it also makes it very thick, which meant that seam finishings had to be considered very carefully. It unraveled really easily. So I needed the seams to be exactly what I wanted them to be the first time. Any unpicking could mean I'd actually lose part of the fabric itself by kind of like fraying and falling off, which would be a problem with some of the fit, since this was a very like specifically tailored jacket. Side note, if you're saying, why didn't you just serge it? Because I could have just serged it, which would have helped a little bit. Well, it's couture. No, I'm kidding. I just don't have a serger. Was the toile perfect the first time out the gate? No, it definitely wasn't, especially on the bust. So here is the pattern piece for the jacket. If you can see, there is no bust dart because the bust dart has actually been redistributed to this seam here, which actually forms almost like a gusset under the sleeve. And then that shaping happens right here. When I was first sewing up the toile, I wasn't incredibly precise. Again, this is a pattern I drafted. There weren't specific instructions. I ended up giving it a very generous seam allowance, like do some alterations. So I ended up having to take in the bust line on this quite a bit here. And then I also had to take in the back a bit. And then the last big thing that I tested out on the toile was the piping on the sleeve. I love the contrast piping on the Vivienne Westwood inspiration. So I wanted some piping as a nod to that, and also so that the lovely seam details didn't get lost in all of the pattern of the fabric. The decision of adding contrasting piping wasn't purely cosmetic though. It was also a structural choice. Terry toweling isn't the strongest material, so on curves and points of tension, it's often encouraged that you use a piece of bias binding to reinforce that, or potentially to use some sort of interfacing. And the piping basically served as both a visual decoration and essentially bias binding on the inside to reinforce that seam. For the final jacket, I ended up making my own little bias binding out of this check fabric, which is also on all of the facings. And as you can see, cut on a bias, even though it's kind of like a canvas that otherwise has like no directional stretch, on the bias has quite a nice little stretch there. So once the toile was fitted and I was really happy, the last step was to compare the toile to my pattern pieces so that the final cut pattern for the jacket would be exactly the fit that I wanted. Then I drew out all of my facings using my existing pattern pieces. So I was like, where is there an edge? Let me create a little facing piece. It's faced all along the back, along the front, the bottom, all the way around. And then once I had all my facings, I was ready to start sewing. So on Friday night, I was finally ready to make the final garment. So I cut it out and started sewing. Since I had tested out some of the more complicated things, most of the time on this final jacket was really spent making sure that everything was precise and prepared properly before I stitched it, because like I said, I really didn't have the luxury of being able to unpick it without losing fabric on the terry toweling, so it had to be right the first time. On Friday night when I stopped sewing, I was really satisfied because I had the entire front piece and the entire back piece completed, ready to go. All of the facing was on, pattern pieces were together. And the only thing that was left was to put them together and then sew this big giant seam. On Saturday morning, I kicked off the day by sewing this lovely long seam that extended from the center of the neck all the way down the arms, even to the sleeve. Again, I really loved how a piece of piping here really calls attention to the curvature on that sleeve and the fact that there is no separation between the sleeve and the front and the back of the jacket. But that also means it kind of like sews together like a sandwich like this. The buttonholes almost broke me. Saturday afternoon at this point, deadline approaching, I had gone cross-eyed. I asked my husband to solidify the button colors because I was just like, I don't care at this point. He picked out the little teal one, so I thought he did a good job. For button spacing, I used the logic in the tour jacket making book of the button stand being about 6 millimeters plus 1 centimeter, which was half of the diameter of the button. The book also recommended that the first button be placed 1/2 inch or 1.3 centimeters below the break point for the collar if you have one. And then the distance between your buttons should be that first button to the end of your desired button stand divided by the number of buttons you have. And they also say that an odd number of buttons is perceived to be more attractive. So I have 5 buttons that start where they're supposed to, and the buttons were spaced evenly, roughly 2.4 centimeters apart. But the buttons were the easy part. The very last thing that I did were bound buttonholes. I loved the idea of this contrasting fabric peeking through on just this small detail of the buttonhole. It is the couture way to really finish a buttonhole, also called a fabric buttonhole. Conceptually, I can do bound buttonholes very easily in my head. They're a challenging concept the first time you do them, and if you do welts or jets in a jacket, that's a great way to kind of experience the logic behind it, because it's the same with a buttonhole, only much smaller. But I really didn't realize what a hot mess terry cloth would be at trying to do this incredibly precise cutting. So another thing in the couture technique, you should always interface that piece of the jacket, which I did to make sure that that fabric was strong enough to do all of these precise teeny little cuts and corners, but it still didn't keep the terry cloth from shedding and really struggling to hold those precise seams. Honestly, I think it's the sloppiest part of the garment. It was the 11th hour though, and I had to give myself a little pep talk of like, they're gonna look ugly, maybe the buttons will hide them, we're just gonna keep going, because I had to get it done. So I sucked it up, powered through, did some hand stitching. Whether I loved the bound buttonholes or not, it was finished and I had a completed jacket. So what were my takeaways after finishing this incredible project? Having come off of a podcast recording earlier in that week when I was very unsure that I was even gonna try to do something like this, I'm impressed with myself. The techniques and the skills that I use to create this jacket are things that I've been working on consistently for this past year. And this jacket feels like a culmination of all of that learning and practice coming together to create something really beautiful. I mean, can we take a moment to look at this back seam? It's so damn straight. Precision, something I don't always achieve. This was such a great example of when it really makes a huge difference to actually practice and to toile something. Although I do like to try it toile in a fabric where this will eventually get finished and be something I will wear, which I think is always a good thing because it gives me a little bit more opportunity to experiment, play around, and turn it into a slightly different version of something that will live in my closet and I will enjoy. If I hadn't given myself that opportunity to test things out on the toile, to screw it up, to take it apart, to try again, I would definitely not have been able to move as quickly as I was on the final jacket. And of course, I want to know what you thought of the jacket. I think it turned out pretty darn good, don't you? Thanks for watching. I can't wait to see you next time. Ooh, and if you have any ideas of things you would like me to try to make next, I'm taking suggestions. Thanks for watching. I'm Rebecca. See you next time.